My thanks to Parity for this opportunity to disburden myself of some thoughts and observations which I hope you'll find of relevance to the excellent cause which Parity represents. I do lamentably have the reputation of being a rather miserable old devil. My talks do indeed tend to focus on the negative, inevitably, as they generally focus on male disadvantages and hence are negative by their nature. And this talk will be no exception. However, let me at least begin on a positive note. It's 4 years since my book, The Empathy Gap, was published, so it seems appropriate to review a few of the most salient events over the intervening time. I also hope to say a few words about the work of the charity of which I'm trustee. Families Need Fathers, Both Parents Matter Cymru, the Welsh charity, not the English one. However, firstly, some positives, all relating to parliamentary matters. Without doubt, the most significant positive development in the last 3 years has been the creation of the APPG, the all-party parliamentary group on issues affecting men and boys. This was the doing of Mike Bell, who deserves recognition for its creation and for acting as secretary ever since. For the issues of men and boys to have a regular forum for discussion within Parliament is a very welcome development, and no doubt there is something to be learnt from Mike's manner of achieving it. Secondly, I note the continuing achievement of debates in Parliament on International Men's Day each year. This only comes about because a submission is made to the relevant backbench committee to hold one. In the last 3 years, we've had debates led by Ben Bradley and Nick Fletcher. In 2020, Bradley had the nerve to ask why we don't have a Minister for Men, which was a landmark event, I think. I suspect that was the first time that such a suggestion had been voiced in Parliament. Let us draw a veil over the pillorying that Bradley received in the press for it, which gave the usual culprits an excuse to advertise their ignorance and bigotry. Last year, Nick Fletcher scored points with me for being forthright regarding the realities non-resident fathers face in seeking child contact. I don't think anyone has previously stated in Parliament so bluntly that every other weekend is what fathers can expect, if they are lucky. And even then, they can also expect court orders to be breached routinely with no consequences. If the IMD debates provide a forum for such taboo but universally known truths to be voiced in Parliament and recorded in Hansard, then let no one doubt their value. And in 2021, the IMD debate, and let us here draw a veil over the embarrassing display of male feminist bigotry by the SNP's Gavin Newlands. On the positive side, amongst other contributions, Kemi Badenoch, then Minister for Equalities, deserves a shout out for raising the inclusion of parental alienation in the Domestic Abuse Act draft guidance, as it then was, and praising Philip Davis for his work on that issue. I shall return to parental alienation shortly, but I note that Badenoch's remark shows that even she, as Equalities Minister, did not know of the minor coup that was to be enacted between November 21 and June 22 on that matter. Badenoch, I note, also gave Martin Seeger and male psychology a mention, which was most heartening. And finally, in terms of positive developments, education. Another development consisted of a pair of government reports which presented the factual position on the effects of ethnicity, class and sex on educational attainment, a position that was starkly revealed to be at odds with the approved but empirically false narrative. The first was the government's independent report of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, published 31st of March 21. The second was the Education Committee's report of the 22nd of June 21, The Forgotten: How White Working Class Pupils Have Been Let Down and How to Change It. The bottom of the educational heap in terms of ethnicity are white British and black Caribbeans, and the intersection of those ethnicities with the male sex is by far the very bottom. In contrast, black Africans are up there with Indians and Chinese. Add class to this intersection, and white working class boys are by far the largest group of educationally disadvantaged pupils. In interview, Mercy Maroki, one of the committee responsible for the first of those reports, explicitly referred to single-parent families as culprits in underperforming offspring. There's another taboo but universally known truth for you. The second report explicitly demolished the idea of white privilege in the educational context and warned schools that they may be in breach of the 2010 Equalities Act if they appear to promote such ideas. That report noted correctly that whatever ethnicity or class is considered, boys do worse than girls. Consequently, whilst not explicitly discussed, the idea of male privilege was also implicitly discredited in the educational context. In respect of parental involvement in education, the report observes, "We know that parents who are willing and able to engage with their children's education have a positive influence on it. But we must not assume that all parents have the knowledge and skills to do so." Indeed, quite true, but nor should we assume that all parents even have the opportunity to do so. Huge numbers of parents are effectively denied meaningful opportunity due to lack of contact after parental separation. A key matter which the Education Committee had the perfect opportunity to raise, but seems to have been too frightened to mention. Moving now on to salient events, which lamentably are not so positive, and addressing firstly education. I know that Parity hosted an address by Keith Saunders on the education gender gap a little while ago, so I'll not say too much more on education. However, the debacle of the COVID lockdown-induced examless years 2020 and 2021 must be mentioned. The stupidity of the government in opting for making awards without exams would be hard to fathom were it not for its ready explanation: political expediency, which drives their every action. A child of 10 could anticipate the controversy that would obviously ensue. Those working behind the scenes in 2020 attempted, sensibly, to moderate teachers' over-generous assessments by application of an algorithm to realign the awards with past exam-based experience. But parliamentary politicians were not to be denied an opportunity to throw brickbats at the government, the result being that the teachers' assessments, preposterously over-egged though they were used unmoderated to make the final awards. The direct use of teachers' assessments presented an opportunity to measure teachers' bias by sex of pupil. I duly did so for the A-level awards. In 2020, I divided the subjects available into 28 subject areas and found a bias in favour of girls in every single one to varying extents. The average bias in favour of girls was 3.2%. In 2021, the following year, no doubt encouraged by being unchallenged the previous year, the average bias in favour of girls increased to 4.7%. Just how serious was the bias is illustrated by the figure on the screen now. It's worth noting how preposterous was, say, the A-star grade inflation, that's the top grade. In 2019, based on exams, just 3.7% of girls were awarded an A-star in computing. In 2021, based on teachers' assessments, that became 25.7%. In 2019, just 6.1% of girls were awarded A-star in sports and PE. In 21, that became 27%. Similarly, in further maths, 22% became 50.7%, and in physics, 8.5% became 25.3%, and so on. Boys' awards were also inflated, but not by quite so much. As a result, girls became dominant in almost all A-level subjects in 2021 as regards the percentage being awarded A-star grades. Based on exams in 2019, a larger percentage of boys than girls attained A-star grades in 11 subjects: English literature, chemistry, French, maths, further maths, physics, classics, German, music, religious studies, and other sciences. In 2021, based on teachers' assessments, that list of 11 had shrunk to just 3. A larger percentage of girls than boys were then awarded A-star, even in the male bastions of maths, further maths, and physics. What this means in terms of the competition for top grades, and hence the competition for places at the best universities, is that in 2020, an excess of 24,400 A-star grades were awarded to girls rather than to boys, due entirely to teacher bias. And in 2021, it was worse still, as the bias resulted in nearly 40,000 more top A or A-star grades being awarded to girls compared to boys than would otherwise have been the case. Given the competition for top university places, this suggests that the order of 20,000 or so places at top universities might have gone to girls than would otherwise have gone to boys, due entirely to preferencing one sex over the other by teachers. In 2021, the Department for Education rejected claims of systematic bias against boys in the year's A-levels, saying that this possibility had been ruled out by an analysis carried out by Ofqual. I examined the Ofqual report closely, as I do. It's a typical example of how inconvenient facts can be hidden without actually being mendacious. The key result is expressed in such an anodyne fashion that the general reader has no chance of grasping its importance. They wrote, "Some groups showed notable changes from 2019 to 2021 on all 3 results measures. Male candidates, and some others, have seen from 2019 to 2021 a small decrease in outcomes." Less subtly, the graphical results use a scale so small that nothing can clearly be made out, as the figure on the screen now shows. As obfuscations go, this is insultingly crude. They've simply wound down the scale so that you can't see the histogram bars. But the Ofqual report does, in fact, derive a very similar result to myself, if you know where to find it. They identify as an average across the subjects analysed that being female improved your probability of gaining an A or A star grade by 4.36%. This is closely comparable with the average bias that I found, namely 4.7%. So, the Department for Education has actually covered up a flagrant bias based on sex of substantial proportions, despite the fact it was actually identified in the Ofqual report. But why would they not, after long decades of doing exactly that? Just to remind you, putting on the screen again now, this was the true extent of the bias. Moving on now to domestic abuse. The gestation of the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 spanned several years and changes of government and involved multiple public bill committees. The long, sorry saga of this parade of discrimination masquerading as care and protection began in 2018. But it did not end when the Act became law in April 2021. The grand finale, or to be more precise, the grand nadir, came only in July 22. The Public Bill Committee in 2020 received 95 submissions, 10 of which were from male-friendly organisations or male victims. None were invited to give evidence in person. The 16 invitees were all feminist organisations or female victims. Time was that there would have been at least one male-friendly presence as a token gesture. But now the feminist establishment is arrogant and complacent in their power. The one win we thought we would get from this otherwise depressing tale was to be implemented via the statutory guidance. Such guidance is often more important than the primary legislation itself, as it sets down the specifics of what will be done in practice. It's via such statutory guidance that ostensibly gender-neutral legislation is interpreted in a sex-specific manner. Our anticipated big win was going to be via the statutory guidance, or so we thought. We thought that parental alienation would be explicitly covered in the guidance as an example of coercive or controlling behaviour, and hence a criminal act. We had every reason to believe this when we saw the draft statutory guidance in June 2021. It's worth taking a look at the specific text that was included in that draft guidance relating to parental alienation. Quote, using children to control their victim, for example, threatening to take the children away or manipulating professionals to increase the risk of children being prevented from having contact with the victim. Alienating behaviours, including invidious drip feeding of negative views to a child by one parent about the other parent, or any attempt by one parent to frustrate or limit the child's contact with the other parent other than for reasons based on concern about the risk to that child. And there was a footnote to that paragraph which read, Whilst there is no single definition of alienating behaviours, sometimes referred to as parental alienation, the Children and Family Courts Advisory and Support Service, CAFCAS, defines parental alienation as when a child's resistance or hostility towards one parent is not justified and is the result of psychological manipulation by the other parent. The draft guidance also included the following as constituting abusive behaviours. Quote, turning children and friends against the victim, including falsely and without justification, telling a child that the other parent abandoned them, never loved them, or never wanted them. Distorting a child's memories about the victim parent, including telling a child that the other parent will pick them up or meet them when that was not true. Falsely telling medical staff or school staff that they have the sole custody of a child so that no information is provided to the other parent. Painting the other parent in a negative light to the child, including mocking their personal characteristics, their job, friends, family, and belittling them, including in front of the child. So, in the July 2021 draft guidance, it was clear that parental alienation was explicitly included as a form of controlling or coercive behaviour and as a form of emotional or psychological abuse, and therefore unambiguously a form of domestic abuse of both the alienated parent and the child. But then, suddenly, it wasn't there anymore. All the above extracts from the draft were removed from the statutory guidance when it was formally published in July 2022. The moral for backbench MPs is that, should they fail to get amendments included in a bill, do not fall for a government department's line when they say, don't worry, we'll include that in the statutory guidance. What the public do not realise is the power of government departments and hence an individual minister to make up the law unilaterally via such statutory instruments. The DA Act statutory guidance could be changed and was changed without any explanation or discussion unilaterally by the minister, Priti Patel in this case. This was a successful cover-up of a serious form of abuse by the responsible minister. This is bad for children, bad for fathers, and bad for mothers, and so is a win for no one other than certain political or ideological lobbies. And that brings me to the Istanbul Convention. No doubt keen to secure her legacy before being ousted from office, on the 21st of July, the same month that the altered DA Act guidance was published, the same Home Secretary delivered another gift to the feminist lobby: ratification of the Istanbul Convention, properly titled the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. My contention is that the Istanbul Convention, hereafter the IC, was ratified under false pretences. This relates to MP Philip Davis's concern over the ratification of the IC. One of the issues he raised in a formal letter to the Home Office was the applicability of the IC to male victims. On the 14th of July 2022, Mr. Davis received a reply from Baroness Williams of Trafford in her capacity as a Home Office Minister of State. The relevant extract is, "I would like to reassure you that my ministerial colleagues and I are satisfied that the Convention applies to male victims of these crimes as well as female ones. The letter goes on to reassure us that otherwise they, quote, would not have signed up to it and would not now be ratifying it. The question that arises is this: what was the basis of the Home Office's claim that the IC also applies to male victims? The IC itself gives no hint that it could apply to male victims and every indication to the contrary. Now, the IC is a product of the Council of Europe. It must therefore be the Council of Europe that is empowered to give a definitive answer to the key question: does the IC also apply to male victims? So we asked them. And on the 28th of July 2022, just 7 days after ratification, we got an answer by email which read, "Thank you for your inquiry about the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, also called the Istanbul Convention. Article 2 of the Convention sets out its scope. This convention shall apply to all forms of violence against women, including domestic violence, which affects women disproportionately. This means that it is only applicable to women victims of violence, including women victims of domestic violence. However, the preamble of the convention recognizes that men may also be victims of domestic violence and explicitly encourages its state parties to apply its provisions to all victims of domestic violence. Article 2, paragraph 2. Therefore, state parties to the Istanbul Convention are under a legal obligation to apply its provisions to women victims of all forms of violence as covered by the scope of the convention, but it is left to the discretion of each member state whether or not to apply the convention also to male victims of violence. Kind regards, Secretariat of the Council of Europe." So, the IC does not apply to male victims, and there has never been any reason to think so. Nor has there been, to my knowledge, any UK ruling that the IC is to be applicable also to male victims. There has only been a mistaken belief that the IC per se applies to male victims, which it does not. The ratification of the IC by the UK was therefore carried out under false pretenses. To add to this unsatisfactory position, note that Baroness Morgan has tabled an amendment to the Online Safety Bill in its passage through the House of Lords, requesting in that bill that the following statement is inserted: "Violence against women and girls has the same meaning as violence against women in Article 3 of the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention." If Baroness Morgan's amendment is adopted, it would make the term exclusive of men and boys also in the Online Safety Bill. Confusion reigns. You will no doubt recall that the Crown Prosecution Service's definition of VAUG, violence against women and girls, is inclusive of male victims. This indeed gave rise to a Home Office report with the preposterous title, "Supporting Male Victims of Crimes Considered Violence Against Women and Girls," a piece of nonsense which rebounded on the Home Office in the form of widespread and fully justified ridicule. But this is where you end up when you try to have it both ways, being quite happy to include male victims in VAUG when it inflates the victim statistics and conveniently vanishes away male victimization, but reverting to the IC gender exclusive definition when there is service support, funding, or prosecutions in question. I suppose I must mention the June 2020 harms report, the affectionate abbreviation for the report assessing risk of harm to children and parents in private law children cases. But really, I just don't have the strength. Besides, Terry here has gone into it in even more detail than myself. I'll just allude in passing to something that emerged accidentally from Terry's attempt at a judicial review of that report. The government's legal department claims that parents have no automatic right to contact with their own children. This does not refer just to fathers, nor does it just refer to the context of parental separation. The government appear to believe that your children are theirs, though they might, if they wish, delegate their care to you. If you doubted our government's authoritarian tendencies, do so no more. I'll also skip over a couple of bills that are currently in progress, which have the potential to pose threats to men's well-being, the online safety bill and the firearms and hate crime bill. Again, I note that Terry had an article in Parity's February newsletter on the former, specifically the threat to outlaw misogyny. These types of legislation are always skewed in one gender direction, even when the formal wording appears gender neutral, both because subsequent guidance may not be so neutral, but also because such things as hate or fear or harm always gravitate to female victims rather than male. But instead, let me turn to criminal justice, specifically in the context of sexual offences. One worries about how low the bar has become. It seems that almost any contact of a female by a male can be labelled as sexual assault. Moreover, the nature of sexual offences makes them problematic to the point that in most cases, there's no independent evidence that an offence has been committed. The offence generally hinges upon the state of mind of the complainant. No one knows what percentage of allegations, say of rape, are false. Indeed, the very question is so ill-defined as to be meaningless. What constitutes an allegation? What constitutes false? So anyone insisting they have the definitive figure, be it 0.6% or 90%, merely betrays their lack of appreciation for the ambiguities of the question. However, those who think the rate of false allegations is so low it can be ignored are wrong. 5 years ago, I did a brief review of false allegations of rape or other serious sexual assaults, confining attention to the UK. It was disconcertingly easy to find many cases, even though my only source was newspaper reports. I easily found 146 cases among the general public, not including celebrities or politicians. 15 involved men initially being convicted and imprisoned. Several served their full term before being exonerated. 25 involved serial false accusers who accused more than one man in separate incidents. 14 of them more than 2 men, 9 more than 3 men, and in one case, 15 different men. I found a further 70 cases involving politicians or celebrities, of which I judged 50 to be not guilty of a criminal offence. This personal research, which took only a couple of months, colours my personal view of how common false allegations probably are. We are told that women never lie about rape. Oddly then, I was able from the news accounts to identify the reasons for the female accusers having made false allegations in the cases among the general public. Namely, regret sex, 19 cases, rejection, 14, revenge or anger, 14, to hide infidelity, 10, attention seeking, 10, extortion, blackmail, fraud, or for the compensation money, 9 cases, political reasons, 4 cases, delusional complainants, 4 cases, for sympathy, 4 cases, for reasons of jealousy, 3 cases, and finally, my favourites at the end here, 2 cases to excuse poor exam grading, I kid you not. And finally, the winner, in 1 case, to get a lift home in a police car. These are the reasons why women are happy to put a man in prison for 10 years and to completely ruin his life. Amazing, isn't it? And that brings me to Operation Soteria. But first, a bit of recent history in the UK. In late 2017, there was a flurry of rape cases which failed due to disclosure failures. That is, the failure of the police to disclose key exculpatory evidence until the last moment or until forced to do so. This led, you will recall, to the early resignation of the little lamented Alison Saunders as Director of Public Prosecutions. It also led to the Justice Select Committee carrying out an investigation of disclosure failures. What they uncovered resulted in perhaps the most savage condemnation of any government function I have ever read coming out of a parliamentary body. So dysfunctional was the CPS that even when under such intense scrutiny, the most celebrated disclosure failure case in recent times, that of Liam Allen, had not been recorded as such by them. Moreover, even months later, Alison Saunders was unaware of that fact. The Select Committee found it necessary to emphasise some fundamental principles of justice, including 1. Prosecutors must always act in the interests of justice and not solely for the purpose of obtaining a conviction. 2. It is fundamentally important that all police officers recognise that they're searching for the truth. You wouldn't think it would be necessary to reiterate that, would you? But it is. And 3, the law is clear in that the right to a fair trial is an absolute right which cannot be violated to protect the right to privacy. That last point relates to the excuse which had become common that protecting a complainant's privacy trumped searching their social media messages for crucial exculpatory evidence. The only thing very often that stands between an innocent man and having his life ruined and spending 10 years or so in prison. I stress this history of only 5 years ago because Operation Soteria is intent on ignoring all those principles of justice and implementing a process which will be unconcerned with disclosure failures because its objective is solely to maximise the number of convictions irrespective of justice, and I am not exaggerating. In July 2022, the DPP Max Hill with Chief Constable Sarah Crew, National Police Chiefs Council Lead for Rape and Adult Sexual Offences, issued a press release on Operation Soteria which makes the following clear. Quote, close joint working with the Crown Prosecution Service from the very start of an investigation means we can build the best possible cases more quickly. Best possible case means the strongest possible prosecution case. Exculpatory material plays no part in their thinking. Quote, Operation Soteria drives a strong focus on closer joint working between the police and prosecution teams across the country to drive up the number of successful prosecutions. And do note that successful means obtaining a conviction, not obtaining the judicially correct outcome. Quote, Operation Soteria Pathfinder projects will give clear evidence of which approaches have the biggest impact. Biggest impact, of course, means the largest increase in convictions, irrespective of truth. Quote, a key shift has been a move to increase early advice where police can consult a prosecutor on investigative strategy from the beginning to talk through the evidence needed to build and strengthen the case, the prosecution case. Justice does not feature in the objectives of Operation Soteria, only driving up the number of convictions. It could not be more contrary to the Justice Select Committee's reiteration of the basic principles of justice. It is quite staggering that neither the DPP nor the Chief Constable of Avon and Somerset seem to have grasped that what they are doing is profoundly wrong. In this context, it's worth noting that Scotland is poised to start conducting rape trials with no jury, exactly what the feminist lobby have been pressing for decades, though they are encountering difficulties from lawyers who have not lost all sense of justice. A familiar feature of totalist regimes is their capture of the justice process. Totalist regimes are generally held in power by an ideology which permeates the whole culture. This is necessary if the justice process is to be corrupted, because the enactment of injustice in myriad cases requires many individuals to comply. Ideology is the means by which this is achieved, including the knowledge that ideological alignment is key to promoting selfish interests. To this end, feminism will serve just as well as Marxism.